The market hasn't crashed. In fact, over the last 4 years, prices, they've stayed surprisingly strong. But homes, they are sitting on the market longer, and sellers, they're still chasing yesterday's numbers. If you're buying a home in Sandpoint, Idaho, or you're thinking about selling, it's time to rethink that strategy before the summer rush. I'm gonna walk you through what's happening in our market right now, how it compares to the last few years, and what it all means for your next step. I'm Ben Geanetta. I'm a realtor right here in Sandpoint, Idaho. I'm helping people just like you buy homes and sell homes in this beautiful part of the world. So if you want to talk more about the housing market right here in Sandpoint, go ahead and schedule a time in my calendar. You're going to find the link down below in the description. First, let's talk about the Bonner County market and what's been going on in the past 12 months. So the average list price over the past 12 months up here in Bonner County, which Sandpoint is part of, was just over $1.13 million. The average sold price, right around $765,000. That's a gap of $365,000, which on paper, it sounds like a big deal. That's basically a second home, or in many cases, that is a first-time home in our area. But this isn't a crash, it's really a soft landing. What we're seeing right now in Bonner County is a small shift in leverage, a gap between what sellers want and what buyers are actually willing to pay and accept terms with. So that $365,000 gap, it may seem like a big red flag of a market crash, but here's why it's not as dramatic as it may look on paper. We've seen several homes listed for $4, $5, even $6 million in that range, and they did not sell. They're still sitting on the market as of today, or they came off the market and they never came back on the market. Those unsold luxury listings, they're inflating the average list price, but they're not impacting the sold price because, well, you guessed it, they have not sold. Meanwhile, homes between $400,000, $500,000 up to $800,000. Well, guess what? Those homes in the last year, 2, 3 years are moving. And that's what's pulling that average sold price down. This is exactly why I prefer a rolling 12-month average when you're looking at average sell price of homes. The rolling 12-month is a better metric to look at instead of just looking at the month-over-month average sell price, because it smooths out the outliers and it gives a clearer view of what's actually happening in the market. So let's move on to the seasonal rhythm and just the market psychology. So December of 2024, we saw a huge number of homes come off the market. But guess what? That is typical up here in our market. We're in a snow climate, so we're gonna get a lot of precipitation, we're gonna get a lot of snow, and when the ground is frozen, roofs are buried in snow, and there's a snow everywhere, it's tough for buyers to walk around the property, check roofs, and even get inspections to see any deficiencies about that house. So sellers, they usually are going to pause their listing, they're gonna take it off, and they're gonna wait until the springtime, and they're gonna wait for the snow to go away, and we're gonna see an uptick in inventory. And right on cue, in 2025, we saw 147 new listings come on the market in March. But here's where this winter was just a little bit different. We actually saw more buyer activity than usual. I had showings on my listings, and those same buyers were showing up at my team members' listings and other homes around town where I'm friends with those agents. We were comparing notes and like, oh yeah, this buyer came and oh, they went to yours. And then we kind of saw a trend that if they were coming to my listing, they were going to that one and that one, or whatever order, but they were seeing the same houses. But they just weren't pulling the trigger because guess what? All these houses that I'm talking about, they're still on the market. Demand was there. There's buyers out there. They're ready to get that house, but in the end, when you look at all of it, the buyers are still cautious. They're not committing. They want to have a deal up in our market. If it doesn't smell like a deal, or if it smells like the seller is just not going to budge on price or terms or anything like that, they're just not pulling the trigger. So what does this mean for buyer behavior right now in our market? Well, I think there's still a window for the buyers to get a good deal in this market, to have cooperation from the seller, especially when you're looking in that lower tier of $400,000 to $800,000 range. This window is closing. I can't stress that enough, because mortgage rates and other factors are going to make affordability more affordable, and that's going to bring more competition into the market. And when we have more competition, that's when the sellers start to get more leverage. They're going to stick to their listing price. They're going to have terms that favor them. And when we're talking about this price range, again, $400,000, $800,000, these homes, they're not sitting on the market nearly as long as other houses that are going to be more in that $800,000 to $1.2, $1.5 million range. Those lower priced homes, they're like 30, 40, maybe 50 days on market. So they are moving quicker. And then when we compare that price range, that lower price range, to the next price range just above it, that lower price range, they're actually getting about 2% closer to the listing price than the rest of the market. So what does that mean? In that lower price range, the sellers are getting more of what they're asking than the next tier, if you will, of price range. So that means there's still competition there, because if there's not competition, you're going to see a higher gap of list price to sell price. And like I just mentioned, this market right now is really driven by mortgage rates, and we've already seen how fast demand can pick up around here when the rates drop. Just a couple weeks ago, rates dropped into the mid-6 range, and immediately we saw more showings, more mortgage applications, and more buyers locking in their rates. So right now, sellers in this range, they're going to be more open to concessions and price flexibility, creative terms like flexible possession or closing cost credits. This is why I'm saying this window is starting to close here sooner than later on this lower price inventory that we have. So what happens as the market starts to shift more to sellers? Well, those negotiation tools, they're going to just disappear. You're not going to have the leverage. You're not going to be able to ask for that price reduction because the seller just doesn't have to meet those terms. They can wait for the next buyer that will meet their terms. So if you're serious about buying, this might be the best moment for you to get the price, the terms, and the timing that you want. So now let's move on to more national trends that are impacting the US mortgage rates and the buyer demand. First, I want to talk about what's driving the bigger picture, and that's mortgage rates. We just talked about that. So rates are closely tied to the 10-year US Treasury yield. When the 10-year yield goes up, so do mortgage rates. And when it goes down, rates tend to follow and go down as well. Just a couple weeks ago, mortgage rates, they dropped into the mid-6s. I just said that. And we immediately saw more buyer activity. So yes, mortgage rates do drive demand, especially in this market, because we have high prices. And when you have high prices and high rates, it's going to make affordability really difficult. The 10-year Treasury yield is influenced by inflation expectations, economic outlook, and the Fed policy. Right now, as of mid-April of 2025, the 10-year Treasury is sitting right at 4.34%. For some context here, in 2024, it averaged at 4.15%, in 2023, about 3.96%, and all the way back in 2022, it hovered right around 2.94%. So we're still elevated, but we've come a long way off the peak of that volatility from last year. A high 10-year yield, Treasury yield, that's bad for mortgage rates, and a low one, that's going to be good. That's kind of breaking it down as simply as I can. So if you're waiting for better affordability, just go ahead and keep your eye on the 10-year yield note. So let's talk about inflation, shelter CPI, and rate watch, and how all that works together. So specifically CPI and shelter CPI. In March, we saw the first negative CPI print in over a year, and that is a big deal. That's a big signal. Now, shelter CPI, which makes up a huge chunk of the overall CPI report, is based mostly on rent data, and it lags real-time market conditions up to a year to a year and a half. So even if rents started leveling out 6 months ago, it might just now start showing up in the CPI reports. And that's exactly what we saw. And that's part of why the 10-year dipped and mortgage rates followed shortly after. But let's be clear, shelter CPI is not home prices. It tracks the cost to live in a home, mostly through rent. So when shelter CPI comes down, it doesn't mean that home values are crashing. It means that inflation pressure is starting to ease, and that's good. That's good news for mortgage rates. If this trend continues, we could see more of a downward pressure on rates, which means better affordability and more buyer demand. Now let's talk about the housing wealth and inventory grid law. So right now, the US homeowners, they're sitting on about $35 trillion in housing wealth, which is huge. And that could be a problem sitting on all that wealth. And I'll explain in a little bit. Roughly 40% of homes, they're owned free and clear. They don't have a mortgage. And the people that do have a mortgage, the average equity that they have in their house is nearly 50%. This is really important data. So no, we're not looking at a foreclosure crisis, but we are looking at a gridlock. Why? Because people, they want to give up their 2.75% mortgage and buy something that's at 6.75, 6.5. That's a huge dramatic change. But we are starting to see a little bit of that. I am talking to sellers where life happens and they have to move and they don't want to have a rental, so they're selling and then they're buying and they're getting that increased rate. But the overall majority of people, like my brother who has a sub-3 interest rate, he's not going to ever get rid of that house. He's told me that. He's going to go get an RV and go across the country. So why did I say earlier why it's bad to have $35 trillion of equity that's in the housing market? It's not being used because people aren't going to be refinancing and pulling money out, because when you do that, you're getting a new interest rate. Their money is stuck in the house right now. It's kind of hard to use it. There's a ton of equity. There's a ton of money out there tied up in the housing market, but a lot of people aren't anxious to pull it out. So we're calling that a rate lock-in effect because your money is tied in there, you can't refinance, you don't want to buy something new because that rate, it's just too sexy. And then on top of all that, if you add in high construction cost, builder constraints, and that tight labor, inventory is going to stay low. And in fact, since 2008 with that crash, building has never recovered to where it needs to be to help the housing industry. So even though demand has softened maybe a little bit more nationally than we've seen locally, Prices, they're still holding up because supply, it's just not there. Why isn't this 2008? Because this is not 2008, and I'll break it down for you. Back then, the average loan to value ratio was 85%. Today, it's under 50%. In 2010, 23% of homes, they were underwater. Today, now, 1.8%, which is historically low. Buyers today, they are better qualified, they're putting down more of a down payment, and they are carrying less of a risk. And we've shored up all those bad lending practices. You can't just walk in and have a pulse, fog a mirror, and get a loan. There's a lot more restraints and qualifications to get a loan. So right now what we have is a market that's driven by affordability constraints, not financial instability. And that is a big difference from what we're seeing today to what happened in 2008. Here's the bottom line. Sandpoint's housing market, it has not crashed, it's only adjusted, and it has been adjusting for 3 years. And if you actually look at a map, the average sale price of a house in the Sandpoint area in Bonner County has had responsible growth. You're seeing it go up slowly year over year. And that's good. That's good for the housing market. All that being said, if you're serious about buying or selling, go ahead and interview me. You're gonna be glad that you did. And make sure that you leave me a comment down below and let me know what you think the housing market is going to do in 2025.